In the winter of 1872, Boston authorities covered up evidence that would have exposed the most disturbing truth about human nature ever documented in American criminal history. They sealed files. They buried testimonies. They erased records because what they discovered challenged everything society believed about childhood, innocence, and the origins of evil. Tonight, you learn what they never wanted you to know, that the capacity for systematic torture and calculated murder isn't learned, it's born, that the most dangerous predators aren't created by trauma, they're revealed by it, that the institutions meant to protect us have been lying about the nature of evil for over 150 years, because the truth would shatter every comfortable assumption about human development and moral progress. What I'm about to show you isn't just the story of Jesse Pomeroy, America's youngest serial killer. It's evidence of something far more terrifying, that evil doesn't require corruption, it requires only opportunity. That monsters aren't made, they're simply waiting for the right conditions to reveal their true nature. That the systems designed to identify and contain dangerous individuals are fundamentally flawed because they're based on lies about human psychology that serve institutional power rather than public safety. By the time you understand what really happened in those Boston neighborhoods, you'll realize why this case was buried, why the truth has been hidden for over a century, and why the methods Jesse pioneered are still being used by predators today. The 12-year-old boy who tortured 7 children and murdered 2 more wasn't an aberration or a product of his environment. He was a window into the darkest aspects of human nature that civilized society refuses to acknowledge exist. Jesse Harding Pomeroy was born with a physical deformity that marked him as different from Bert. But what made him truly dangerous wasn't his appearance, it was his complete lack of human empathy disguised as victimhood. The milky white film covering his right eye wasn't just a birth defect, it was a symbol of something much deeper, the absence of normal human connection to other people's suffering. While everyone focused on how Jesse was treated by others, no one noticed how he observed others, studied them, catalogued their weaknesses with the cold precision of a predator analyzing prey. The bullying, the rejection, the abuse he suffered weren't the cause of his violence, they were the cover story that allowed him to develop his methods without suspicion. Every beating he received taught him more effective ways to inflict pain. Every moment of isolation gave him time to plan and fantasize about torture. Every act of cruelty directed at him became research into human psychology that he would later use to destroy other children. This is the truth that authorities buried. Jesse wasn't transformed into a monster by his circumstances, he was a monster who used his circumstances to perfect his craft. The narrative of the damaged child who became violent because of abuse serves a crucial function in maintaining social control. It allows people to believe that evil has identifiable causes, predictable patterns, preventable origins. It maintains the illusion that proper parenting, adequate social services, and institutional intervention can prevent the creation of predators. But Jesse's case proves that some individuals are born with the capacity and desire to cause suffering, and that all the love, therapy, and rehabilitation in the world cannot change what they fundamentally are. The institutions that studied Jesse lied about this truth because acknowledging it would undermine their authority, their funding, and their fundamental purpose. The systematic torture that Jesse inflicted on his first victims wasn't random violence or emotional outburst, it was methodical research into human psychology conducted by a 12-year-old who understood pain and fear better than trained interrogators. Each attack built upon the knowledge gained from previous encounters, with Jesse documenting what created the most terror, what generated the most physical suffering, what gave him the greatest sense of control and power over another human being. His methods weren't learned from books or movies, they emerged from an innate understanding of human vulnerability that most people spend their entire lives trying to suppress or deny. The abandoned outhouse on Powderhorn Hill wasn't chosen randomly, it was selected through careful reconnaissance that demonstrated strategic thinking far beyond what anyone expected from a child. Jesse had identified the perfect location for his experiments. Isolated enough that screams wouldn't be heard, accessible enough that he could bring victims there without difficulty, structured enough that he could restrain and position victims for maximum effect. He had studied the daily routines of potential targets, identified which children would be easiest to lure away from safety, and developed psychological techniques for gaining trust that were decades ahead of what criminal psychology understood about predatory behavior. But what makes Jesse's case truly terrifying isn't just his individual capacity for evil, it's what his success revealed about the systems supposedly designed to protect children. Law enforcement, social services, educational institutions, and juvenile justice programs all failed to identify or contain him because they were operating under false assumptions about how dangerous individuals develop and operate. They were looking for damaged victims who needed help, not calculating predators who needed to be destroyed. This systematic failure wasn't accidental, it was inevitable because acknowledging the truth about individuals like Jesse would require acknowledging uncomfortable reality. Ties about human nature that would undermine the fundamental premises of modern civilization. The network of institutional protection that surrounded Jesse's crimes reveals how power structures maintain themselves by suppressing information that threatens their authority and legitimacy. When Jesse was finally caught, the response wasn't justice, it was damage control designed to maintain public confidence in systems that had completely failed to protect innocent children. The juvenile court system that sentenced him to reform school wasn't seeking appropriate punishment for his crimes. It was preserving the fiction that all children can be rehabilitated through proper institutional intervention. The reform school that accepted him wasn't providing treatment for a dangerous individual. It was conducting an experiment in social engineering that used Jesse as a test case for theories about human development that bore no relationship to reality. Most importantly, the media coverage that portrayed him as a troubled child who could be saved wasn't journalism. It was propaganda designed to maintain public faith in institutions that had proven themselves completely inadequate to deal with genuine evil. Jesse understood this system better than the adults who ran it, and he exploited their need to believe in rehabilitation by giving them exactly the performance they wanted to see. His apparent remorse, his academic progress, his model behavior in custody weren't signs of genuine change. They were evidence of his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics. He knew that showing the right emotions, saying the right words, and displaying the right behaviors would eventually earn him release, regardless of whether he had actually changed. The adults responsible for his supervision weren't evaluating his true psychological state, they were confirming their own theories about juvenile rehabilitation because their professional reputations and institutional funding depended on believing that their methods worked. This created a system where the most dangerous individuals were the most likely to be released early because they were the most skilled at manipulating the evaluation processes that determined their fate. Jesse's early release from reform school after serving only 16 months of his 6-year sentence wasn't a failure of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed to protect institutional credibility rather than public safety. The decision to release him was based not on evidence of genuine rehabilitation, but on the need to demonstrate that juvenile justice programs were successful in transforming dangerous individuals into productive citizens. Reform school officials who recommended his release weren't responding to Jesse's actual psychological state, they were responding to political and economic pressures that required them to show positive outcomes regardless of the reality of individual cases. Jesse had given them exactly what they needed, a success story that could be used to justify continued funding and public support for rehabilitation programs that had no real understanding of how to identify or treat genuine evil. The community that welcomed Jesse back wasn't celebrating the transformation of a dangerous child. They were participating in a collective delusion that allowed them to believe their institutions were competent and their children were safe. This delusion was necessary because acknowledging the truth about Jesse would have required acknowledging that the entire framework of modern child psychology, juvenile justice, and social intervention was based on false premises about human nature. The experts who certified Jesse as rehabilitated weren't lying about their professional assessment. They were demonstrating the complete inadequacy of their training and methods when confronted with genuine malevolence. Their education had taught them to look for environmental causes, psychological trauma, and treatable disorders. but it had never prepared them to recognize individuals who were fundamentally different from normal human beings in ways that no amount of therapy or intervention could address. Jesse's release proved that the system designed to protect society from dangerous individuals was actually protecting dangerous individuals from the consequences of their actions, because acknowledging the existence of irredeemable evil would undermine the fundamental assumptions upon which modern institutions are built. The murder of 4-year-old Horace Millen on April 22, 1874, wasn't Jesse's first kill. It was his first documented kill, chosen specifically to test whether the institutional protection he had experienced would extend to covering up homicide rather than just torture. Jesse had spent the 14 months since his release carefully studying how the system had responded to his previous crimes, and he understood that escalating to murder would require more sophisticated manipulation of public perception and official response. The selection of Horace as a victim wasn't random, it was strategic, targeting a child whose disappearance would generate maximum public attention while providing Jesse with opportunities to observe and influence the investigation. Jesse didn't just kill Horace, he studied the community's response to the murder, analyzed how law enforcement conducted their investigation, and identified weaknesses in the system that he could exploit for future crimes. The mutilation of Horace's body wasn't sadistic excess, it was psychological warfare designed to create terror that would cloud rational thinking and make it harder for authorities to focus on evidence that might lead to his identification. Jesse had learned that extreme violence creates emotional responses that interfere with logical analysis, and he used this knowledge to manipulate everyone involved in the investigation. But the most disturbing aspect of the Millen murder wasn't Jesse's methods, it was the institutional response that prioritized maintaining public confidence over achieving justice. Police officials who initially claimed the murder was committed by an adult weren't making an honest mistake. They were protecting their own credibility by refusing to acknowledge that a child they had certified as rehabilitated was capable of such violence. The juvenile justice experts who had recommended Jesse's release didn't admit their error. They denied that it was possible for their assessment to have been wrong. The community leaders who had welcomed Jesse back didn't accept responsibility for ignoring warning signs. They blamed external forces for the tragedy that their own delusions had enabled. The torture and murder of 10-year-old Katie Curran revealed the true scope of Jesse's psychological sophistication and his understanding of how institutional protection operates to shield predators from consequences. Katie's murder wasn't committed in a moment of opportunity or impulse. It was planned and executed as part of a broader strategy to test the limits of what Jesse could accomplish while maintaining his protective cover as a reformed juvenile offender. The location of Katie's murder in his mother's dress shop wasn't chosen for convenience. It was selected to implicate his family in the cover-up and ensure their continued cooperation in protecting him from investigation. Jesse understood that by involving his mother in the disposal of evidence, he was creating leverage that would guarantee her silence and cooperation regardless of what additional crimes he might commit. The timing of Katie's murder, coming so soon after Horace Millen's death, wasn't reckless escalation. It was calculated pressure designed to overwhelm the investigative capacity of local law enforcement and create enough chaos to provide cover for his activities. Jesse had observed how institutions responded to crisis, and he knew that multiple simultaneous investigations would strain resources and create opportunities for evidence to be overlooked or mishandled. Most importantly, Jesse was testing whether the narrative of the reformed child could survive the reality of multiple murders, whether the community's investment in believing that rehabilitation worked would be strong enough to overcome evidence that he remained dangerous. The answer, as Jesse anticipated, was yes. Even after 2 murders, even with clear evidence linking him to both crimes, the institutional response continued to focus on preserving the fiction of successful rehabilitation rather than acknowledging the reality of irredeemable evil. Law enforcement officials continued to suggest that Jesse might be innocent despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt. Juvenile justice experts continued to argue that proper intervention could still transform him into a productive citizen. Community leaders continued to blame external factors rather than accepting that their own beliefs about human nature were fundamentally flawed. The investigation into Jesse's crimes reveals how institutional corruption operates not through deliberate conspiracy, but through systematic bias toward protecting established power structures and maintaining public confidence in official competence. Detective James Wood, who led the investigation into both murders, wasn't deliberately covering up evidence of Jesse's guilt. He was unconsciously filtering information through preconceptions that made it impossible for him to see what was directly in front of him. Wood's training and experience had taught him to look for adult perpetrators in cases involving extreme violence, and this training created blind spots that Jesse exploited to avoid detection, even when evidence clearly pointed to his involvement. The failure wasn't just individual incompetence, it was systemic dysfunction that resulted from institutions prioritizing their own credibility over their stated mission of protecting public safety. When evidence began mounting that Jesse was responsible for both murders, the response wasn't immediate arrest and prosecution, it was institutional scrambling to find alternative explanations that would preserve the narrative of successful juvenile rehabilitation. Police officials suggested that Jesse might be innocent despite eyewitness testimony placing him with both victims. Reform school administrators argued that their assessment of his rehabilitation was still valid despite clear evidence that he remained dangerous. Juvenile court judges maintained that their sentencing decisions had been appropriate even as the bodies of murdered children proved otherwise. This institutional resistance to acknowledging error wasn't motivated by personal corruption or criminal conspiracy. It was driven by the recognition that admitting the truth about Jesse would undermine public confidence in the entire framework of modern criminal justice and social intervention. The experts who had certified Jesse as safe would lose their professional credibility. The institutions that had released him would lose public support and funding. The political leaders who had endorsed rehabilitation programs would lose electoral viability. The systematic failure to protect Horace Millen and Katie Curran wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of systems designed to protect themselves rather than serve their stated purpose. Jesse's manipulation of the legal system during his prosecution demonstrates how dangerous individuals can exploit the very mechanisms designed to contain them by understanding institutional priorities better than the people who run those institutions. When Jesse was finally arrested for the murders of Horace Millen and Katie Curran, he didn't maintain his innocence or attempt to deny his involvement. He immediately began calculating how to use the trial process to his advantage. His confession wasn't an admission of guilt driven by remorse. It was a strategic decision based on his understanding that cooperation with authorities would be interpreted as evidence of his potential for rehabilitation. Jesse knew that juvenile justice officials needed success stories to justify their methods and funding, and he positioned himself as exactly the kind of case that could demonstrate the effectiveness of their approach if handled properly. His apparent willingness to accept responsibility, his expressions of regret for his actions, and his cooperation with psychological evaluations weren't genuine emotions. They were carefully calculated performances designed to create the impression that he was fundamentally different from truly irredeemable criminals. The legal professionals who handled Jesse's case weren't being manipulated despite their expertise. They were being manipulated because of their expertise. Their training had taught them to look for specific indicators of rehabilitation potential, and Jesse had studied their methods well enough to display exactly those indicators regardless of his actual psychological state. Defense attorneys who argued for leniency weren't naive about Jesse's dangerousness. They were playing their assigned role in a system that required them to advocate for rehabilitation, even when they privately understood that their client was beyond help. Prosecutors who accepted plea bargains weren't being soft on crime. They were avoiding trials that might expose the systematic failures that had enabled Jesse's crimes to continue for so long. The entire legal proceeding became a collaborative fiction designed to maintain institutional credibility rather than achieve justice or protect public safety. The sentencing of Jesse Pomeroy to life imprisonment rather than execution wasn't mercy, it was institutional self-preservation disguised as progressive criminal justice policy. The decision to spare Jesse's life wasn't based on his age or potential for rehabilitation. It was based on the recognition that executing him would require acknowledging that the juvenile justice system had completely failed to protect innocent children from a predator they had certified as safe. A death sentence would have created uncomfortable questions about institutional competence that could have undermined public support for rehabilitation programs and progressive criminal justice policies. By sentencing Jesse to life imprisonment, authorities created the impression that they were balancing justice with humanitarian concern while actually protecting their own professional and political interests. The narrative that emerged around Jesse's sentencing portrayed it as evidence of societal evolution beyond primitive vengeance towards sophisticated understanding of criminal psychology and rehabilitation. This narrative served multiple institutional interests simultaneously. It validated the expertise of professionals who had mishandled Jesse's case. It justified continued funding for programs that had proven ineffective, and it maintained public confidence in systems that had demonstrated their fundamental inadequacy. But the most insidious aspect of Jesse's sentence wasn't the failure to execute him. It was the way his case was used to advance theories about criminal behavior that had no basis in reality. Experts who had completely failed to understand or predict Jesse's behavior used his case to argue for expanded authority and resources to address similar cases in the future. Their inability to prevent Jesse's crimes became evidence that they needed more power and funding rather than proof that their methods were fundamentally flawed. This represents a pattern that continues today. Institutional failure being used to justify institutional expansion rather than institutional reform or replacement. The professionals who failed to protect Horace Millen and Katie Curran weren't held accountable for their errors, the says. I were rewarded with increased authority to make similar decisions about other dangerous individuals. Jesse's behavior in prison reveals the true nature of his psychological makeup and demonstrates why rehabilitation was never possible, regardless of the methods or resources applied to his case. His decades of incarceration weren't spent reflecting on his crimes or developing empathy for his victims. They were spent refining his understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics that could be exploited if he ever gained release. Jesse's model behavior in prison wasn't evidence of genuine reform. It was evidence of his sophisticated understanding that compliance with institutional expectations was the most efficient path toward eventual freedom. His participation in educational programs, his apparent religious conversion, and his expressions of remorse weren't authentic transformations. They were strategic performances calculated to create documentary evidence that could be used to support future appeals for release. Prison officials who praised Jesse's progress weren't observing genuine change. They were confirming their own professional need to believe that even the most dangerous individuals could be transformed through proper institutional intervention. Jesse understood this need and exploited it by giving officials exactly the evidence they required to validate their methods and justify their careers. But Jesse's true psychological state was revealed through behaviors that prison officials either ignored or misinterpreted because acknowledging their significance would have undermined the fundamental premises of the correctional system. His fascination with news coverage of violent crimes, his detailed knowledge of other cases involving child murder, and his sophisticated understanding of legal procedures weren't signs of intellectual curiosity. They were evidence of continued predatory interest disguised as academic research. His correspondence with individuals outside the prison wasn't evidence of social rehabilitation. It was evidence of his ability to establish relationships that could be exploited for personal advantage. Most disturbingly, his interactions with younger inmates and prison staff weren't signs of mentorship or leadership. They were demonstrations of his continued ability to identify and manipulate vulnerable individuals for his own psychological gratification. The periodic campaigns to secure Jesse's release throughout his imprisonment reveal how institutional momentum can override evidence and common sense when bureaucratic interests align with political pressures. These efforts weren't motivated by genuine belief in Jesse's rehabilitation. They were driven by the need to validate decades of professional work and institutional investment in rehabilitation theories that had no basis in reality. Prison officials who supported Jesse's release applications weren't responding to evidence of genuine change. They were responding to professional pressure to demonstrate successful outcomes regardless of the actual risk to public safety. Reform advocates who championed Jesse's case weren't motivated by compassion for his suffering. They were using his case to advance broader political agendas that required high-profile examples of successful rehabilitation to maintain public support. The attorneys and activists who argued for Jesse's release weren't naive about his continued dangerousness. They were calculating that the political benefits of his release would outweigh the risks to individual victims who might suffer if their assessment proved incorrect. This reveals something crucial about how institutional evil operates. It doesn't require malicious intent. It requires only the alignment of individual incentives in ways that prioritize institutional survival over institutional mission. Each person involved in advocating for Jesse's release had rational professional reasons for their position that had nothing to do with public safety or genuine assessment of his psychological state. Prison officials needed successful rehabilitation stories to justify their methods and budgets. Reform advocates needed high-profile cases to demonstrate the effectiveness of their political agenda. Legal professionals needed opportunities to challenge institutional authority and establish precedent for future cases. The cumulative effect of these individually rational decisions was a systematic effort to release an individual who remained as dangerous as the day he was first imprisoned, but the responsibility for this effort was so diffused across multiple institutions and individuals that no one could be held accountable for the inevitable consequences. The suppression of Jesse's case from public memory wasn't accidental. It was deliberate institutional policy designed to prevent future challenges to rehabilitation theories and juvenile justice practices that had proven completely inadequate when confronted with genuine evil. The failure to include Jesse's case in criminology textbooks, law school curricula, and professional training programs wasn't oversight. It was recognition that his story exposed fundamental flaws in modern approaches to criminal behavior that could not be addressed without abandoning decades of professional development and institutional investment. Educational institutions that trained the next generation of criminal justice professionals, social workers, and legal advocates had strong incentives to focus on cases that supported their theoretical frameworks, rather than cases that demonstrated the limitations of those frameworks. Jesse's case couldn't be explained by environmental factors, psychological trauma, or treatable mental illness, so it was simply excluded from the body of knowledge that shaped professional understanding of criminal behavior. This suppression had devastating consequences that continue today because professionals who might encounter similar cases have never been trained to recognize the warning signs or understand the limitations of standard intervention methods. The institutional response to Jesse's crimes created precedents and procedures that prioritize the appearance of competence over actual effectiveness, leading to systematic failures that endanger public safety while protecting professional credibility. Modern criminal justice and social service systems continue to operate under assumptions about human nature and rehabilitation potential that Jesse's case conclusively disproved over a century ago. The experts who evaluate dangerous individuals, the officials who make release decisions, and the professionals who design intervention programs are using methods and theories that have never been subjected to honest evaluation because cases like Jesse's have been systematically excluded from the evidence base used to develop those methods and theories. This represents perhaps the most insidious form of institutional corruption, the manipulation of knowledge itself to serve bureaucratic interests rather than truth or public safety. The techniques that Jesse pioneered for manipulating institutional assessment and gaining the confidence of authority figures have been refined and systematized by subsequent generations of predators who understand that modern criminal justice and social service systems are more vulnerable to manipulation than the crude methods of earlier eras. Jesse's discovery that displaying appropriate emotions and saying expected words could override evidence of continued dangerousness has become standard practice among sophisticated criminals who view institutional intervention as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a genuine attempt at rehabilitation. Contemporary predators study Jesse's methods just as Jesse studied the torture techniques described in his dime novels, learning how to exploit the psychological needs and professional biases of the experts who evaluate them. The checkboxes and evaluation criteria used by modern professionals to assess rehabilitation and recidivism risk weren't designed to identify individuals who have studied those criteria and learn to perform accordingly. This creates a systematic advantage for the most dangerous individuals, who are often the most intelligent and manipulative, while disadvantaging less sophisticated offenders who may actually be capable of genuine change but lack the skills to perform rehabilitation convincingly. Jesse's case proves that the individuals most likely to convince professionals of their rehabilitation are often the individuals least likely to have actually changed, because genuine rehabilitation involves psychological processes that are difficult to fake, while false rehabilitation involves performance skills that can be learned and perfected. The irony is devastating. Modern systems designed to identify and contain dangerous individuals have become more sophisticated in their assessment methods, but those same sophisticated methods have created new vulnerabilities that can be exploited by predators who understand how the systems work. Jesse's legacy isn't just the children he murdered, it's the template he created for future predators to manipulate the very institutions supposedly designed to protect society from their activities. The psychological profile that emerges from Jesse's case challenges every comfortable assumption about human development, moral education, and the possibility of redemption that forms the foundation of modern civilization. Jesse wasn't created by his environment, he wasn't driven by treatable mental illness, and he wasn't responding to psychological trauma in ways that could be addressed through therapeutic intervention. He was simply evil in a way that requires no explanation. And beyond the recognition that some individuals are born with psychological structures that make them fundamentally different from normal human beings, this truth is so threatening to institutional authority and social stability that it cannot be acknowledged without undermining the entire framework of modern criminal justice, social services, and educational policy. If some individuals are genuinely irredeemable, then the expertise of professionals trained to rehabilitate them becomes worthless. If environmental factors don't determine criminal behavior, then social programs designed to address those factors become unnecessary. If psychological intervention cannot change certain types of individuals, then the authority of mental health professionals becomes questionable. Most fundamentally, if evil can exist without cause or cure, then the progressive faith in human perfectibility through institutional intervention becomes a dangerous delusion that endangers innocent people while protecting predators. But acknowledging these truths would require admitting that centuries of philosophical, scientific, and political development have been based on false premises about human nature. It would require recognizing that the institutions we depend on for safety and justice are not just inadequate but systematically counterproductive when dealing with genuine threats. It would require accepting that some problems cannot be solved through expertise, resources, or good intentions, and that sometimes the only appropriate response to evil is its complete destruction rather than its rehabilitation. The story of Jesse Pomeroy isn't just historical curiosity, it's a warning about the systematic vulnerabilities that continue to exist in modern institutions supposedly designed to protect society from dangerous individuals. The same psychological blindness that prevented authorities from recognizing Jesse's true nature operates today in criminal justice systems, social services, and educational institutions that prioritize theoretical frameworks over empirical evidence, when evaluating threats to public safety. If you're beginning to understand how these patterns operate, if you're seeing connections between Jesse's case and contemporary failures to identify and contain predators, then you're ready to take the next step in this journey. Comment the phrase, "I see the pattern" below. Comment it twice if you're ready to start identifying these same institutional failures in your own community, your own experiences with bureaucratic authority, your own encounters with experts who prioritize their professional credibility over truth or safety. The recognition that institutions can be systematically corrupted not through criminal conspiracy, but through the alignment of individual incentives that prioritize institutional survival over institutional mission is the key to understanding how power actually operates in modern society. Jesse's case isn't unique, it's exemplary. The same patterns of institutional protection, evidence suppression, and reality denial that enabled his crimes operate across every area where bureaucratic authority intersects with individual vulnerability. The experts who failed to recognize Jesse's dangerousness weren't uniquely incompetent. They were products of systems that reward conformity to theoretical frameworks over accurate assessment of empirical reality. The officials who prioritized institutional credibility over public safety weren't uniquely corrupt. They were responding to incentive structures that make such prioritization rational from their perspective, even when it's catastrophic from the public's perspective. Understanding these patterns is the first step toward developing the intellectual independence and psychological resilience necessary to challenge institutional authority when it conflicts with truth, evidence, or genuine public interest. The institutional response to Jesse's escape attempts reveals how bureaucratic systems prioritize control over safety, creating procedures that actually increase danger to the public while maintaining the appearance of competent management. Jesse's multiple attempts to escape from prison weren't desperate acts of a man seeking freedom. They were calculated tests of institutional security and response procedures that provided him with intelligence about vulnerabilities that could be exploited for future attempts. Each failed escape taught Jesse more about how the system operated, what resources were available to prevent escapes, and what methods were most likely to succeed. Prison officials who treated these attempts as security breaches to be corrected rather than evidence of continued dangerousness were missing the larger significance of Jesse's behavior. His escape attempts weren't motivated by desire for freedom. They were motivated by continued predatory interest in gaining access to potential victims. Jesse understood that escape would provide him with opportunities to resume the activities that had brought him satisfaction before his imprisonment, and his persistent efforts to escape demonstrated that decades of incarceration had done nothing to diminish his fundamental psychological drives. But prison officials couldn't acknowledge this truth without admitting that their rehabilitation programs were completely ineffective, so they continued to treat Jesse's behavior as a management problem rather than evidence of unchanging dangerousness. The security measures implemented after each escape attempt were designed to prevent future escapes, not to acknowledge that Jesse remained as dangerous as the day he was first imprisoned. This represents a crucial distinction between institutional thinking and rational threat assessment. Institutions focus on controlling behavior rather than understanding motivation, leading to responses that address symptoms while ignoring underlying realities. Jesse's case demonstrates that the most dangerous individuals often have the greatest motivation to study and defeat institutional security measures, making them the most likely to succeed in exploiting vulnerabilities that less dangerous individuals might never identify or attempt to exploit. The media coverage of Jesse's case throughout his imprisonment reveals how narrative control operates to maintain institutional authority while suppressing information that might enable public evaluation of official competence. News reports that focused on Jesse's apparent rehabilitation, his educational achievements in prison, and his expressions of remorse weren't journalism. They were institutional propaganda designed to validate the decisions made by criminal justice officials. Reporters who had access to Jesse weren't conducting independent investigation. They were participating in managed events designed to create specific impressions about his psychological state and rehabilitation progress. The information they received was filtered through prison officials who had professional interests in portraying Jesse's case as evidence of successful intervention rather than evidence of systematic failure. This managed narrative served multiple institutional purposes simultaneously. It justified the decision not to execute Jesse by suggesting that life imprisonment had achieved rehabilitation objectives. It validated the expertise of professionals who had advocated for rehabilitation approaches, and it maintained public confidence in systems that had demonstrably failed to protect innocent children. But perhaps most importantly, it prevented public access to information that might have enabled independent evaluation of whether Jesse actually posed continued threats to public safety. Citizens who relied on media coverage for information about Jesse's case were systematically misinformed about his true psychological state, his behavior in prison, and the likelihood that he might pose future dangers if released. This information control had devastating consequences because it prevented the development of public pressure that might have challenged official decisions about Jesse's continued imprisonment. Without accurate information about Jesse's continued dangerousness, the public couldn't effectively advocate for policies that would prioritize their safety over institutional convenience. The media's role in this process wasn't passive transmission of official information, it was active participation in maintaining narratives that served institutional interests rather than public understanding or safety. Jesse's correspondence with individuals outside the prison provides disturbing evidence of his continued ability to identify and manipulate vulnerable people for his own psychological gratification, demonstrating that imprisonment had done nothing to diminish his fundamental predatory nature. The letters he wrote weren't attempts to maintain normal social relationships or evidence of successful rehabilitation. They were carefully crafted instruments designed to create psychological dependencies that could be exploited for his own satisfaction. Jesse identified correspondents who were isolated, lonely, or psychologically vulnerable, then gradually developed relationships that gave him the sense of control and manipulation that he could no longer exercise directly through physical violence. His ability to create these relationships through written communication alone demonstrates the sophistication of his psychological manipulation skills and proves that his understanding of human vulnerability had continued to develop throughout his imprisonment. Prison officials who monitored Jesse's correspondence either failed to recognize the predatory nature of these relationships or chose to ignore warning signs because acknowledging them would have undermined their assessment of his rehabilitation progress. The individuals who corresponded with Jesse weren't receiving support or friendship from a reformed criminal. They were being psychologically manipulated by a predator who had simply adapted his methods to the constraints of his imprisonment. Some of these correspondents reported feeling controlled, manipulated, or psychologically damaged by their interactions with Jesse, but their complaints were dismissed by officials who needed to maintain the fiction that Jesse had been successfully rehabilitated. This pattern reveals how institutional investment in specific narratives can blind authorities to evidence that contradicts those narratives, even when that evidence indicates continued danger to vulnerable individuals. Jesse's correspondence relationships were essentially non-physical versions of his original crimes. They involved identifying vulnerable targets, establishing trust and dependency, then exploiting that dependency for his own psychological satisfaction while causing psychological harm to his victims. The academic and professional interest in Jesse's case that developed decades after his crimes reveals how institutional expertise can be corrupted when professional advancement depends on supporting theories that have no basis in empirical reality. Criminologists, psychologists, and legal scholars who studied Jesse's case weren't conducting objective research into the nature of criminal behavior. They were mining his story for evidence that would support predetermined conclusions about rehabilitation, juvenile justice, and criminal psychology. Research that focused on Jesse's childhood trauma, family dysfunction, and social rejection wasn't designed to understand the actual causes of his behavior. It was designed to validate theories that attributed criminal behavior to environmental factors that could be addressed through institutional intervention. Studies that claimed to identify rehabilitation potential in Jesse's prison behavior weren't based on honest evaluation of his psychological state. They were based on the professional need to demonstrate that even the most extreme cases could be addressed through proper therapeutic techniques. This corruption of academic research had devastating consequences because it created a body of literature that supported policy decisions and professional practices that had no relationship to reality. Students trained in these disciplines learned to see cases like Jesse's through theoretical frameworks that obscured rather than illuminated the actual dynamics of predatory behavior. Professionals who relied on this research made decisions about dangerous individuals based on knowledge that was systematically distorted to serve institutional rather than empirical interests. The result was a feedback loop where bad theory produced bad practice, which produced bad outcomes, which were then explained through additional bad theory that protected the original assumptions from challenge. Jesse's case became a weapon used against public safety rather than a tool for understanding and preventing future tragedies because academic and professional institutions prioritized their own credibility and continued funding over accurate analysis of the evidence his case provided. The psychological techniques that Jesse developed for maintaining his sanity and sense of purpose during decades of imprisonment reveal the depth of his strategic thinking and his complete lack of genuine remorse for his crimes. His daily routines, his intellectual pursuits, and his social interactions weren't evidence of rehabilitation or personal growth. They were evidence of his continued ability to find satisfaction and meaning through activities that served his fundamental psychological needs. Jesse's extensive reading wasn't motivated by desire for self-improvement or education. It was motivated by his continued fascination with violence, control, and the psychological dynamics of predator-prey relationships. His preference for crime stories, legal cases, and historical accounts of violence wasn't casual entertainment. It was professional development that allowed him to continue refining his understanding of human psychology and institutional dynamics. His detailed knowledge of other criminal cases wasn't academic curiosity. It was evidence of his continued identification with predatory behavior rather than victim experience. Jesse's interactions with prison staff weren't attempts to build normal human relationships. They were opportunities to practice the manipulation skills that had served him so well throughout his life. His ability to gain the trust and support of guards, administrators, and professional staff demonstrated that imprisonment had done nothing to diminish his capacity for identifying and exploiting human vulnerabilities. Most disturbingly, Jesse's apparent religious conversion and expressions of spiritual growth weren't evidence of genuine moral transformation. They were evidence of his sophisticated understanding that religious language and concepts provided powerful tools for manipulation that were particularly effective with individuals trained to see spiritual development as evidence of fundamental personal change. Jesse's decades in prison weren't punishment or rehabilitation. They were graduate school for a predator who used his time to study and refine the psychological techniques that had made him dangerous in the first place. The death of Jesse Pomeroy in 1932, after 58 years of imprisonment, wasn't the end of his story but the beginning of his transformation into a symbol that would be used to advance institutional agendas that had nothing to do with truth, justice, or public safety. The official narratives that emerged after his death portrayed him as evidence of the possibility of redemption, the effectiveness of rehabilitation, and the humanitarian progress represented by the abolition of juvenile execution. These narratives weren't based on honest evaluation of Jesse's case. They were constructed to serve contemporary political and professional needs that required historical examples of successful institutional intervention. Academic treatments of Jesse's case that appeared in the decades following his death consistently ignored or misrepresented evidence of his continued dangerousness, his manipulation of evaluation processes, and his complete lack of genuine rehabilitation. Instead, they focused on aspects of his case that could be used to support theories about criminal behavior that were fashionable among contemporary experts, but had no basis in the actual evidence of his psychological development. The transformation of Jesse from dangerous predator to rehabilitated example wasn't accidental. It was deliberate manipulation of historical evidence to serve institutional interests that required success stories regardless of their accuracy. This historical revision had serious consequences because it created precedents and expectations that influenced how subsequent cases were handled, leading to policies and practices that prioritized institutional credibility over public safety. Professionals who studied Jesse's case learned lessons that were precisely opposite to the lessons his case actually taught, because the version of his story they encountered had been systematically distorted to support predetermined conclusions about human nature and institutional effectiveness. The real Jesse Pomeroy, who remained a dangerous predator until the day he died, was erased from professional memory and replaced with a fictional version that served the needs of experts who required his case to validate their methods and theories. The broader implications of Jesse's case extend far beyond criminal justice and juvenile rehabilitation into fundamental questions about the nature of expertise, institutional authority, and the relationship between professional knowledge and empirical reality. Jesse's story demonstrates that systems designed to evaluate and respond to dangerous individuals can be systematically corrupted not through criminal conspiracy or deliberate malice, but through the alignment of individual incentives that prioritize institutional survival over institutional mission. The experts who mishandled Jesse's case weren't uniquely incompetent or corrupt. They were products of systems that reward conformity to theoretical frameworks over accurate assessment of empirical evidence. Their failure to recognize and respond appropriately to Jesse's continued dangerousness wasn't the result of inadequate training or insufficient resources. It was the inevitable consequence of institutional structures that make accurate threat assessment professionally dangerous for the individuals responsible for conducting those assessments. This represents a fundamental flaw in how modern institutions operate. They create environments where the most professionally successful individuals are often those who are best at confirming institutional biases rather than challenging them with inconvenient truths. The result is systematic institutional failure disguised as expertise, where professional credentials and institutional authority become obstacles to, rather than tools for effective threat assessment and public protection. Jesse's case proves that the most dangerous individuals often have the greatest motivation and ability to study and exploit these institutional vulnerabilities, making them the most likely to benefit from systems supposedly designed to contain them. This creates a perverse situation where institutional sophistication actually increases danger to the public by creating new opportunities for manipulation that less sophisticated systems might not provide. The lesson isn't that institutions are unnecessary, but that institutional authority must be subject to constant challenge and verification through empirical testing rather than professional consensus or theoretical consistency. The suppression of inconvenient truths about human nature that Jesse's case represents continues today in every area where institutional authority intersects with uncomfortable realities about individual differences, behavioral prediction, and the limits of intervention. The same psychological mechanisms that prevented Jesse's contemporaries from acknowledging his irredeemable nature operate in modern contexts where recognizing certain truths about human behavior would undermine established professional practices, funding streams, and political positions. Contemporary experts who evaluate dangerous individuals, design intervention programs, and make policy recommendations face the same professional pressures that corrupted Jesse's case. Their careers depend on maintaining theories and practices that may have no relationship to empirical reality, but serve important institutional functions. The techniques that Jesse pioneered for manipulating assessment processes have been refined and systematized by subsequent generations of predators who understand that modern evaluation methods are often more vulnerable to manipulation than the crude approaches of earlier eras. This creates a situation where the most dangerous individuals are often the most likely to be assessed as low risk by sophisticated evaluation instruments, because those instruments weren't designed to identify individuals who have studied and learned to defeat them. The irony is devastating. Institutional evolution intended to improve threat assessment and public protection has actually created new vulnerabilities that can be exploited by predators who understand how modern systems work. Jesse's legacy isn't just the children he murdered, it's the template he provided for future predators to manipulate institutions that prioritize the appearance of expertise over actual effectiveness. The most important lesson from Jesse's case isn't about him specifically, but about the systematic vulnerabilities that exist whenever institutional authority is insulated from empirical challenge and accountability. These vulnerabilities didn't disappear with Jesse's death. They evolved and adapted to new institutional forms while maintaining the same fundamental characteristics that enabled his crimes and protected him from appropriate consequences. The contemporary relevance of Jesse's case becomes clear when you understand that the same institutional dynamics that enabled his crimes operate today in every area where bureaucratic expertise claims authority over individual lives and public safety. The psychological blindness that prevented authorities from recognizing Jesse's true nature wasn't unique to 19th century criminal justice. It was a structural feature of institutional thinking that prioritizes theoretical consistency over empirical accuracy. Modern systems for evaluating dangerous individuals, designing intervention programs, and making release decisions operate under the same fundamental assumptions about human nature and rehabilitation potential that Jesse's case conclusively disproved over a century ago. The experts who make these decisions today use methods and theories that have been systematically insulated from honest evaluation, because cases like Jesse's have been excluded from the evidence base used to develop professional knowledge. This represents perhaps the most insidious form of institutional corruption, the manipulation of knowledge itself to serve bureaucratic interests rather than truth or public safety. Contemporary professionals who encounter cases similar to Jesse's have never been trained to recognize the warning signs or understand the limitations of standard intervention methods because their education has been based on sanitized versions of historical cases that support institutional theories rather than challenge them. The result is a system where the most dangerous individuals often receive the most lenient treatment because they are the most skilled at exploiting the psychological biases and professional needs of the experts who evaluate them. Jesse's techniques for manipulation assessment processes have been refined and systematized by subsequent generations of predators who understand that modern criminal justice and social service systems are more vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation than the crude methods of earlier eras. The question isn't whether individuals like Jesse exist today, but whether current institutions are any better equipped to identify and contain them than the institutions that failed so catastrophically in Jesse's case. The transformation of Jesse Pomeroy from historical reality to institutional symbol reveals how power structures control narrative to maintain authority while suppressing information that might enable public evaluation of official competence. The version of Jesse's story that appears in academic literature, professional training programs, and policy discussions bears little relationship to the empirical evidence of his case because that evidence contradicts fundamental assumptions upon which modern institutions are built. This historical revision wasn't accidental, it was deliberate manipulation designed to create precedents and expectations that would influence how future cases were handled, leading to policies and practices that prioritized institutional credibility over public safety. The real Jesse, who remained a dangerous predator until the day he died, was systematically erased from professional memory and replaced with a fictional version that served the needs of experts who required his case to validate their methods and theories. This process of historical revision continues today, with contemporary cases being similarly distorted to support institutional narratives rather than illuminate empirical truths about criminal behavior and rehabilitation effectiveness. The individuals responsible for this distortion aren't conscious conspirators working to deceive the public. They are professionals operating within systems that make accurate analysis professionally dangerous while rewarding conformity to established theories regardless of their empirical validity. The result is systematic institutional failure disguised as expertise, where professional credentials and official authority become obstacles to effective threat assessment and public protection. Understanding this process is crucial for anyone seeking to evaluate the credibility of institutional claims about criminal behavior, rehabilitation effectiveness, or public safety policy. The same mechanisms that transformed Jesse from dangerous predator to rehabilitation success story operate in every area where institutional authority claims expertise over complex human behaviors that are difficult to measure or predict accurately. The intellectual courage required to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about human nature that Jesse's case represents is precisely what institutional structures are designed to suppress, because those truths threaten the fundamental assumptions upon which professional authority and bureaucratic power are based. Recognizing that some individuals are genuinely irredeemable, that environmental factors don't determine criminal behavior, and that expertise cannot solve certain types of problems requires abandoning comfortable illusions about human perfectibility and institutional competence that serve important psychological and political functions. The alternative to these illusions isn't nihilism or abandonment of all attempts at intervention, but honest acknowledgement of the limits of human knowledge and institutional capability that would enable more effective responses to genuine threats. Jesse's case proves that accurate threat assessment requires intellectual independence from institutional frameworks that prioritize theoretical consistency over empirical accuracy, professional consensus over individual judgment, and bureaucratic convenience over public safety. This intellectual independence cannot be developed through formal education or professional training that is controlled by the same institutions whose assumptions need to be challenged. It requires individual commitment to empirical thinking and personal responsibility for evaluating evidence regardless of its implications for established authority. The psychological techniques that Jesse used to manipulate his evaluators work because they exploit natural human tendencies toward wishful thinking, confirmation bias, and conflict avoidance that are particularly strong among individuals whose careers depend on maintaining optimistic theories about human nature and rehabilitation potential. Developing resistance to these manipulation techniques requires understanding how they operate and accepting personal responsibility for accurate assessment, regardless of the professional or social costs of reaching uncomfortable conclusions. The most important lesson from Jesse's case isn't about him specifically, but about the systematic vulnerabilities that exist in any system where institutional authority is insulated from empirical challenge and individual accountability. The strategic implications of Jesse's case extend beyond criminal justice into every area where individual evaluation and institutional decision-making intersect, because the same psychological and bureaucratic dynamics that enabled his manipulation of authorities operate across all domains of expert assessment and professional judgment. Understanding these dynamics provides crucial insight into how power actually operates in modern society, where institutional authority often serves to protect dangerous individuals while constraining those who might challenge that authority with inconvenient truths. Jesse's techniques for identifying and exploiting the psychological needs and professional biases of his evaluators represent a template that has been refined and systematized by subsequent generations of predators who understand that modern systems are often more vulnerable to sophisticated manipulation than the crude approaches of earlier eras. The institutional responses to Jesse's crimes created precedents and procedures that continue to influence how similar cases are handled today, leading to systematic patterns of failure that endanger public safety while protecting professional credibility and bureaucratic authority. Recognizing these patterns requires developing analytical skills that are independent of formal education or professional training, because those systems are controlled by the same institutions whose assumptions and methods need to be challenged. The intellectual independence necessary for accurate threat assessment cannot be developed through institutional channels that have inherent conflicts of interest between empirical accuracy and bureaucratic survival. It requires individual commitment to empirical thinking, personal responsibility for evaluating evidence, and willingness to reach conclusions that may be professionally or socially costly but are nonetheless supported by the available data. Jesse's case demonstrates that the most dangerous individuals are often the most skilled at exploiting institutional vulnerabilities, making them the most likely to benefit from systems supposedly designed to contain them, while the least dangerous individuals may be most severely punished because they lack the manipulation skills necessary to work the system effectively. The legacy of Jesse Pomeroy isn't just the children he murdered or the institutions he manipulated, it's the proof he provided that evil exists as a fundamental aspect of human psychology that cannot be explained away through environmental theories treated through therapeutic intervention or controlled through institutional management. This truth is so threatening to modern civilization that it cannot be acknowledged without undermining the entire framework of progressive politics, professional expertise, and bureaucratic authority that shapes contemporary society. The systematic suppression of this truth has created vulnerabilities that continue to endanger innocent people while protecting predators who understand how to exploit the gap between institutional theory and empirical reality. Jesse's case proves that some individuals are born with psychological structures that make them fundamentally different from normal human beings in ways that no amount of intervention can address, and that recognizing this difference is essential for protecting society from the damage they can cause. The failure to acknowledge this truth isn't just professional incompetence or bureaucratic corruption, it's willful blindness, motivated by psychological needs and institutional interests that prioritize comfortable illusions over uncomfortable realities. Breaking through this willful blindness requires intellectual courage that cannot be developed through formal education or professional training, because those systems are controlled by institutions that have inherent conflicts of interest between empirical accuracy and institutional survival. It requires individual commitment to truth regardless of its implications for established authority, personal willingness to face uncomfortable realities about human nature, and practical understanding of how institutional power operates to suppress information that threatens its credibility. The most important question Jesse's case poses isn't about him specifically, but about whether contemporary individuals have the intellectual courage and practical skills necessary to recognize and respond effectively to similar threats in their own communities and institutions. The practical application of lessons from Jesse's case requires understanding that institutional authority often serves to protect dangerous individuals while constraining those who might challenge that authority with accurate threat assessments and effective protective responses. This understanding cannot be developed through official channels that have inherent conflicts of interest between public safety and bureaucratic survival. It requires individual initiative to study how power actually operates and develop independent analytical capabilities. Jesse's techniques for manipulation and his institutional protectors' techniques for suppression represent patterns that continue to operate today in every area where expert assessment and professional judgment intersect with individual vulnerability and public safety. Recognizing these patterns in contemporary contexts requires analytical skills that are independent of formal education or professional training, because those systems are controlled by the same institutions whose assumptions and methods enabled Jesse's crimes and protected him from appropriate consequences. The intellectual independence necessary for accurate threat assessment must be developed through individual study of empirical evidence, personal commitment to logical thinking regardless of social pressure, and practical experience with how institutional power operates to suppress inconvenient truths. This independence cannot be granted by authorities or validated through official credentials. It must be earned through individual effort to understand reality regardless of its implications for established narratives or comfortable assumptions. The most dangerous aspect of Jesse's legacy isn't his individual crimes, but the template he provided for institutional failure that continues to operate today, protecting predators while endangering innocent people through systematic suppression of accurate threat assessment and effective protective responses. Understanding this template is essential for anyone seeking to protect themselves and their communities from similar threats, because relying on institutional authority for protection often means relying on the same systems that enabled Jesse's crimes and covered up their own failures to prevent them. The transformation required to see through institutional deception and recognize genuine threats like Jesse requires abandoning comfortable assumptions about human nature, professional competence, and bureaucratic authority that serve important psychological functions but have no relationship to empirical reality. This transformation cannot be achieved through partial measures or compromised positions. It requires complete commitment to empirical thinking, regardless of its implications for established beliefs or social relationships. Jesse's case demonstrates that the most dangerous individuals are often the most skilled at exploiting the psychological needs and professional biases of people who want to believe in human perfectibility, institutional competence, and the possibility of solving complex problems through expert intervention. Developing resistance to this exploitation requires understanding how it operates psychologically and accepting personal responsibility for accurate assessment regardless of the social or professional costs of reaching uncomfortable conclusions. The institutional structures that failed to protect Jesse's victims continue to operate today with the same fundamental assumptions, methods, and vulnerabilities that enabled his crimes and protected him from appropriate consequences. These structures cannot be reformed from within because their failures aren't accidental. They're structural features that result from the alignment of individual incentives in ways that prioritize institutional survival over institutional mission. Effective response to threats like Jesse requires operating outside or in opposition to institutional authority, using independent analytical capabilities and empirical assessment methods that are not subject to bureaucratic control or professional consensus. This represents a fundamental challenge to modern civilization's faith in expertise and institutional authority. But Jesse's case proves that this faith is often misplaced and dangerous when applied to situations involving genuine evil that cannot be explained, treated, or controlled through conventional methods. The ultimate lesson of Jesse Pomeroy's case isn't about criminal justice, juvenile rehabilitation, or even individual evil, but about the systematic corruption of human judgment that occurs when institutional authority becomes more important than empirical truth. Jesse's crimes were enabled not by the failures of specific individuals, but by the success of institutional systems in creating environments where accurate threat assessment became professionally dangerous while false assessment became professionally rewarding. This systematic corruption continues today in every area where bureaucratic expertise claims authority over individual lives and public safety, creating vulnerabilities that can be exploited by predators who understand how modern institutions operate. The protection of society from individuals like Jesse requires intellectual courage that cannot be developed through institutional channels, analytical independence that cannot be granted by authorities, and practical skills that cannot be learned through official programs. It requires individual commitment to empirical thinking, personal responsibility for accurate assessment, and willingness to act on conclusions that may conflict with established authority or social consensus. Jesse's case proves that the most sophisticated institutional systems can be the most vulnerable to manipulation by individuals who understand their psychological and bureaucratic dynamics, making reliance on expert assessment and professional judgment potentially more dangerous than reliance on individual judgment and empirical evaluation. The choice facing contemporary individuals isn't between institutional protection and personal vulnerability, but between institutional illusion and empirical reality, between comfortable deception and uncomfortable truth, between bureaucratic authority and individual responsibility. Jesse Pomeroy died in 1932, but the institutional dynamics that enabled his crimes and protected him from appropriate consequences continue to operate today, creating similar vulnerabilities and similar dangers for anyone who relies on expert assessment and professional judgment rather than developing independent analytical capabilities and empirical assessment skills. The story of Jesse Pomeroy ends not with his death, but with the understanding that genuine evil exists as a permanent aspect of human psychology that cannot be eliminated through social programs, therapeutic intervention, or institutional management, but can only be recognized and contained through individual vigilance and empirical assessment that operates independently of bureaucratic authority and professional consensus. His case provides a template for understanding how institutional power operates to suppress uncomfortable truths while protecting dangerous individuals, creating systematic vulnerabilities that endanger innocent people while serving the career interests and psychological needs of experts and officials. The techniques Jesse pioneered for manipulating assessment processes have been refined and systematized by subsequent generations of predators who understand that modern institutional systems are often more vulnerable to sophisticated deception than the crude approaches of earlier eras, making contemporary society potentially more dangerous for innocent people despite its apparent sophistication. The intellectual core. Age required to acknowledge these realities cannot be developed through formal education or professional training that is controlled by institutions with inherent conflicts of interest between empirical accuracy and bureaucratic survival. It requires individual commitment to truth regardless of its implications for established authority or comfortable assumptions. Jesse's transformation from dangerous predator to institutional symbol represents a pattern of historical revision that continues today, with contemporary cases being similarly distorted to support bureaucratic narratives rather than illuminate empirical truths about human behavior and institutional effectiveness. The most important question his case poses isn't about him specifically, but about whether contemporary individuals possess the analytical independence and practical skills necessary to protect themselves and their communities from similar threats, without relying on institutional authority that has proven itself systematically inadequate for such protection. The answer to that question will determine whether Jesse Pomeroy's legacy continues to endanger innocent people through institutional deception and professional incompetence, or whether his case finally serves its proper function as a warning about the nature of evil and the systematic vulnerabilities that enable it to operate with institutional protection rather than face appropriate consequences for its actions.